doesn't matter how much evidence there is of the general ill intent of the Russians when it comes to the immediate neighbours to the west. People still want to give them the benefit of the doubt.
Yes, this is why we here talk about giving off-ramps to Vladimir Putin to leave the war, but also saving his own face, as Mr. Macron suggested at one point, or initially you had Chancellor Scholz that would be frequently on the phone to Putin, believing that he could somehow convince him to, just by mere words, not by putting any military pressure or by military aid that initially was not sent to Ukraine by the Germans. And initially he thought that maybe a few phone calls could do the work instead. And also it has to be said that in Washington there is still some reluctance, for example, these long-range missiles, the ATACMS, or how slow it is going with the F-16s, or the fact that these cluster munitions, the DPICMs, were sent to Ukraine just a month ago or so, instead of taking that decision much earlier on. It shows that simply in the West there is still not enough understanding for those Russian motives when it comes to the realpolitik.
Which is very, very odd. I genuinely don't understand it. How the left particularly is always prepared to give the Soviets, as they then were, the Russians are there now, the benefit of the doubt, in a way that anybody on the other side of the political spectrum only has to sneeze in the wrong direction and they're immediately chastised and cast into outer darkness. It is bizarre.
Absolutely, and even if the Warsaw Uprising served as a warning, there were some people in the administrations in Washington, and especially in London, there it was actually much clearer than it was in Washington, that it probably won't be possible to have some form of peaceful coexistence with the Soviet power. The Warsaw Uprising was a wake-up call for many, but nevertheless, the lion's share of them, they still had hopes for quite a long time. It's only really with the Berlin crisis in 1948, when the Allies had to do the Western airlift, the Berlin airlift, that it became apparent that the Cold War had really started. Of course, a year earlier, Winston Churchill, who at that point was no longer prime minister, but he delivered his famous Fulton speech at a university in the US state of Missouri, where he talked about an iron curtain having descended across the continent from Stettin in the Baltic Sea to Trieste in the Adriatic. So for him, that was apparent in 1947. It was probably apparent for him already by 1944 and 45.
Well, I think so, which of course is what you alluded to it earlier, his idea, which many people at the time militarily wrote off as complete nonsensical, his soft underbelly of Europe. But of course, I think it was his belief that it was very important for the liberty of the central part of Europe that when the war ended, their Allied forces, and I mean the non-Soviet Allied forces, were as far east as possible, because I think he foresaw what was going to happen. I think it was quite clear that Stalin's view was, when the war ends, the bits where there are still Red Army soldiers, they're ours, one way or another. And I think it seems that Roosevelt didn't quite accept that, or didn't understand. I mean, Roosevelt, of course, the problem with Roosevelt, he was very ill by the end of the war. And he took this bizarre idea that he understood Stalin better than Churchill, and indeed, really unforgivably, allowed Stalin to see this sort of wedge between him and Churchill, which Stalin exploited, of course. And then there was, if you want to be slightly more favourable to the Americans, which is sometimes difficult, then there was this belief in the American side, because this predates the development of the atomic weapons, that Russian Soviet help would be needed to conclude the war in the East with Japan. So there were all sorts of, and which we've said this before, once a war starts it acquires its own momentum, but there were all sorts of issues which everybody was taking into account, which from a Polish point of view looks like betrayal and complete disaster, which it was in some ways, but actually when from the point of view of Churchill or the point of view of Roosevelt, looking at the world as a whole, I think it was very, very different.
Then it also must be stated that when it comes to Roosevelt personally, he was surrounded by a lot of people that it turns out later were most likely Soviet agents. So unfortunately,
I think Roosevelt himself was very cynical, appearing in election posters with a map of Poland in the background. Those sorts of gestures, which were very, very cynical at the time.
so that combination taken together, unfortunately, came together as a perfect storm against the Poles, so to say, and the worst outcome of the war and of the Warsaw Uprising became a reality. Later on, there were also other figures that, just like Churchill, who had his plan with invading the European continent through the soft underbelly in the Balkans. For example, there was General Patton, who believed that after the Germans had been defeated, the Western Allies should come to some agreement with elements of the Nazi Party to simply lay down their weapons and lay down their weapons to the Allies.
Yes,
but
and
then
continue
also,
fighting. Yeah, well, that's very interesting. That's something we must actually look at
yes,
again.
Operation Unthinkable.
Operation Unthinkable, but alas, the unthinkable has happened. It's not unthinkable. We've reached the end of our allotted time, but thank you very much, Adam. That's been very interesting. Well, there we have it. I think a very interesting, slightly different approach to the Warsaw Uprising, looking at the origins in the context of Polish-Soviet relations. I hope you've enjoyed as much as we have, and I look forward to seeing you next time on Poland Daily History. Thank you for watching.